Sensor, the ground motion sensors that they talk about for blast engineering are actually accelerometers that measure motion and acceleration. The sensors we're currently using are velocity sensors, so they measure the velocity of the signal.
Would more information be obtained if there were ground motion monitors around an active injection well site?
The problem with the ground motion sensors is they're not sensitive to weak motion. So while they'll get you good information on larger events, on the smaller events, they don't yield much information for you. That's where the velocity sensors are much more sensitive to weak ground motion. And the smaller the event, they just work much better for recording that type of earthquake.
But you would agree that with a ground motion monitor, in addition to what's out there now, potentially more information would be available.
Absolutely. The more stations, the more sensors, the more information.
To put things into perspective, how often do 2.0 seismic events occur within a state like Ohio?
Well, again, it's site specific. If you talk about Ohio, there's probably a couple events a day occurring out here in Ohio at present. If you're talking California, there's probably 200 or 300 a day. If you're talking Alaska, there's a couple thousand a day.
What type of other activities other than oil and gas injection could induce a 2.0 seismic event?
Probably the most prevalent one would be mining activity or quarrying, quarry blast. The energy release from the explosion for quarry blast will a lot of times far exceed a magnitude 2 event as far as energy, but in underground mining, you do have mine quakes that are associated with mining, and they've been recorded up. I know of a case in Australia that was a magnitude 3.7 occurred inside of the Olympic Dam mine with operators in it.
Would blasting done in connection with a road, so for example, road construction, that trigger a seismic event?
Well, the blasting itself is a seismic event. So we do see on the seismic stations in the ODNR network, when there are large blasts take place, those are picked up. But we can look at the signal and tell the difference between an explosion versus an earthquake just by the type of signals that we see.
The two events that were monitored in connection with the AWMS well, I believe one was a 1.7 and one was a 2.1. How would those compare to, for example, like mining, a blast, or a quarry?
The 1.7, if we convert the energy to, say, a TNT equivalent, it'd be equivalent to a small, construction blast, a couple hundred pounds, maybe up to about 300 pounds of TNT equivalent. The 2.1 would probably be, a small quarry blast of maybe, less than a ton, sort of explosives, which are routinely done here in Ohio and other states.
So in the scheme of things, in the life of the economy of Ohio, these are not unusually large events?
No, not unusually large as far as the state of Ohio.
Now, you are familiar that shortly after the August event, the ODNR suspended in full operations from the number 2 well.
Yes.
Are you aware of this concept of a traffic light response to seismic events?
Yes, I am.
And describe generally what that is in your experience.
From my experience, and I do have a fair amount of experience with traffic light systems from the geothermal industry, and some other jobs that I've worked on in Australia and other places. Basically, what we're trying to quantify is if you have a particular amount of ground motion seen or an earthquake, call it a seismic event occurs, you want to know that if it's going to cause any problems, that you will either throttle back your operations, turn it down to try to relieve and those sort of concerns, or if it is too big, just right from the get-go, is you shut down all operations. And there's some questions on that, even if you just immediately shut in the valve while it's still under pressure. there's concern that that pressure could still trigger something. So there's still a lot of talk on how to do this. I've worked with Dr. Ernie Majors at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in the past on some of the traffic light systems, and what they're going to now are actually what we're referring to as best practices, so that if this happens, here's what you want to do, and to alleviate any, or to try to reduce the risk.
In a traffic light system, such as is routinely used throughout the United States, generally what happens in green, what happens in yellow, and what happens in red?
Well, green, if you have an event that's still in the green area of it, you just continue operations as normal. If you get an event that occurs in the yellow area, normally you want to try to adjust parameters to reduce that activity by either lowering pressures, lowering flow rates, or your total volumes. There's a lot of parameters you can adjust. You might change from, if you're pumping at a high rate for a short duration, you may pump that same volume of fluid, but over a much longer period of time at a reduced pressure.
Sort of level it out.
To level it out. There's a lot of things that can be tried, and in each case we don't know. Each site's specific, so what may work at one site, you might have to do something slightly different at another site. But the whole thing is that you have a protocol in there that says, okay, if this happens, we want to try to do this, and then see what happens and monitor and reduce the risk through monitoring.
Are you personally aware of situations in which a traffic light type response has occurred and the operating criteria of an injection well has been reduced?
Oh yes, that's happened in many places.
Okay. And generally, do you think that the effect of that has been positive?
In most all the cases I know of, it has been.
And let me ask you this. No one seems to be concerned about having a 2.0 or 2.1 event. The concern is that it would suddenly go up to a 4 or 5 or something.
Jackson vagueness.
What was the objection on?
Vague guess and speculation.
Well, I'd like to hear the end of the question.
Not a particularly good question. I will
All
try.
right, you can rephrase what you're trying to do.
Are you aware of any instances throughout the United States where what Dan Arthur called operating criteria, where the rate of flow, the other criteria for the operation well, has been reduced and the seismic activity has increased in magnitude?
I don't know of anywhere in the United States where that has happened.
And are you aware of instances in which the operational criteria were reduced and the intensity, frequency, and/or magnitude of seismic events has been reduced?
Most of the cases that I'm aware of, when they've reduced the pressures and flow rates and parameters, the seismicity has reduced.
But it hasn't gone up.
It has not gone up.